Thank you, Magnus. Dobré odpoledne. I'm going to try and be very quick so we can have more time for question and answers, since we're behind schedule. I'm going to try and draw some lessons out from Nordic cooperation and sort of suggest answers to suggest where the Visegrad 4 are in relation to some of these. And many of these points will have been touched on earlier on today. Particularly Jan Ires had touched on a lot of them. So I'll just reinforce some, but also make some new points. And the first one is that you need really to be realistic, as in don't believe in miracles. And I'd really like to reinforce Jan Ires' point about long-term planning and the necessity of that. Now, Ambassador Vondra gave that a bit of a cold shower at the very end, but I'd suggest that, yes, industry is important, and I'll return to that in my fifth point. But if you don't think about long-term planning, you might as well pack up and go home, because without that, you're not going to achieve anything, at least not substantial savings. Because only by synchronizing procurement horizons can you buy things together, other than just short-term, smaller purchases. This is also a very sort of difficult but also a very clear priority, difficult issue, but also a very clear priority in Nordic defense cooperation. And the long term also is important to build trust. Several have sort of touched upon this, but I'll also sort of just re-emphasize that also in the Nordic context. And this despite the fact that particularly maybe from the outside, but also from the inside, the Nordic cooperation seems like one big family. And particularly on the political left in a lot of the Nordic countries, everything Nordic is by definition good. Nordic, yes, let's go. But it's not that easy. And if you start to dig deeper and start particularly to dig into the sort of opinions of the bureaucracies in different countries and the perceptions and threat perceptions and sort of perceptions of who are the favored partners, you'll find quite big differences between the countries. I'll just sort of, as an example, point to the fact that Norway is politically very preoccupied by the Arctic and developments in the Arctic, and whereas that has now lately come onto the political agenda in Denmark hasn't really been very much interested in the Arctic in the last few years. And Sweden and Finland, for very different reasons, are not interested in the same way that Norway is. Also, on the military side, there is a lot of equipment commonality, as in the same equipment in different countries. But again, the perceptions in the armed services, and just use Norway as an example, are not necessarily very pro-Nordic, because a lot of these militaries, they want to cooperate with the big brothers, as in the United States, obviously, and Great Britain, and Germany, France, and because there is more to learn from these. So, again, as in, one shouldn't expect miracles in any kind, in any way, in such cooperation. One should work with the long run. The long run, however, and sort of this synchronization of defense planning is not very sexy. So it is a political problem in the sense that you cannot just talk about this because people won't be interested, and politicians won't be interested, and even bureaucracy might not even be interested. So you need to build political and institutional support, but you also need to manage the expectations that these, as in your efforts there create. And one way to do that, and one way that is generally chosen, is to have some kind of flagship projects that sort of stand up as sort of the important things that, this is going to do a lot of good for all of us, and sort of ribbons to cut and sort of speeches to be made, etc. And then engage politicians and generals and others. But one should not hinge cooperation on these flagship projects. For those of you who sort of follow the news, the Nordic Defence Cooperation actually got a bit of a shot in front of the bow last week when this big flagship project between Norway and Sweden to jointly purchase this Archer artillery system was basically dropped by Norway. This has been, for many years, one of the most concrete projects that we've seen in the Nordic context. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what the reaction in Sweden is, but if everything hinged on this, then cooperation would fail. So it's necessary to have flagships, but these have to be somewhat big, but not big enough to actually scuttle the cooperation if it goes wrong. And cooperation in terms of training, logistics, and operations elsewhere, that's generally the easiest part, because it's particularly training and operations is often short-term and very concrete. You do things together for a certain period. Logistics also is somewhat easier, particularly when it comes to sort of jointly flying together, like Colonel Nurmelen talked about, and these sort of just buying big sort of necessities in operations together, like whatever, toilet paper or whatever. But as soon as you move up the scale, it becomes more as in towards having integrated units, it becomes more difficult. So in that sense, the Visegrad sort of emphasis on having a battle group is pretty sensible, also based on the Nordic experience, because this, even if this just becomes a one-off effort, which I'll share Jan Hirsch's comment that I hope it doesn't become just a one-off, then it's a flagship, something you can point to, somewhere where politicians can go and make speeches, and this is necessary to build political and institutional support. A third point is that cooperation needs to be flexible and open. You have to allow for multi-speed and multi-relations. It's a friendship, not a marriage, put it in light terms. And this you can see in the Nordic context, and I believe you can see this in the Visegrad context as well, where you have different countries cooperating more closely than others. In the Nordic context, Sweden-Norway has really been the core from the beginning, with Finland coming on board and sort of engaging gradually more and more, whereas Denmark has remained aloof for a very, very long time. Iceland, obviously, there's a difference. They don't have any armed forces, but they participate in this still, albeit obviously the level of their participation is very limited. When it comes to multi-level, then I think as in last week's meeting in Helsinki was a very good case in point, because what you had last week was a meeting of Northern Group defense ministers. That is, Northern Group is basically a British invention and includes the Nordic countries, the 3 Baltic countries, Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. And all of these, well, most of them sent actually ministers. Poland, to be a bit nasty, sent a state secretary who didn't speak English, which was difficult, I understood. But anyway, so there was another group meeting as the widest context. Then there was a Nordic-Baltic meeting, as in what is called NB8, which is a slightly narrower group. And then the final meeting was just in a Nordefco setting. So basically you have all these 3 different layers meeting in one city at the same time. And I think that's a very useful way of going forward. And again, as Colonel Nurmelen talked about, there are sort of other partners in the Nordefco cooperation. The Baltic 3 countries have been mentioned, and also Netherlands, which is very interested in joining. And it's not, I guess, inconceivable that even the Visegrad could start in the future cooperating on a case-to-case basis with the Nordic group as well. And in this sort of context, then, the Visegrad countries again seem to be pretty much on a good track, based on what have been said today here, and what you can see from it. My 4th point is that benefit and cost sharing are very, very important. This is the key. That there needs to be something in cooperation for everyone, and here we come back to sort of partly to what Ambassador Vondra was saying. This about sort of this defense industry side. Defense as industrial benefits are important, and one should not be naive about this. As in, there needs to be a benefit sharing when it comes to this. If we're going to buy something for you, you have to buy something from us. As long as the defense market in Europe is protected like it is, and one can talk about sort of the single integrated market, but at least so far, this is the rules of the game. All countries protect their defense industries if they have any, and they will then demand that there is an industrial participation in cooperation. Because if one country is seen as benefiting disproportionately from a cooperation, that is really a showstopper. If one country sees cooperation as just a means of selling their equipment and not wanting to be as an eager, as not wanting to buy anything back, then this cooperation will run into difficulties. This is a challenge that I would argue that not even the Nordic countries have really faced, because there is very, very limited acquisition, sort of cross-cost cutting. There is some, there's not much. Now, one area where the Nordic countries have a model and have something that could be sort of taken as a model here as well is defense industry cooperation. And the concrete example I'm thinking of is this Nordic ammunition sort of, it's not a factory, but it's sort of a company called Nammo, which has factories in all as in 3 of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And they specialize in different types of ammunition. And there you get political support in all 3 countries for promoting the interests of this company. And this is a sort of pointing to Ambassador Vondra's point that this is perhaps something for the Visegrad countries as well. And my final point is that defense cooperation should not be seen as a replacement for defense spending. If as politicians get the idea that, just as long as we cooperate, we can cut defense budget, that's going to make cooperation fail as well. Because you're not going to see, as in my first point and Jan Ider's point as well, was that you're not going to see cost savings in the short run. It costs maybe even more money in the short run. So there has to be a commitment to actually spend money on cooperation to get it to work. And the Nordics are somewhat okay there, but they're also in a better financial situation than the Visegrad countries. And this, as in one test that will come now pretty soon for the Visegrad countries, is that they actually invest enough money to make the Visegrad battle group to work. As in, if one of the countries fail to meet their obligations or their commitments in this battle group, that's going to be a very strong warning sign to the other partners. And finally, I'll just sort of, I guess, round up by cutting a few points. I always use 15 minutes anyway. But by saying just defense cooperation, the Nordic example shows, is difficult. Even among the best of friends and the closest of sort of historical and cultural ties, it is very difficult. So it needs a lot of political commitment and a lot of attention. And perhaps this seminar might be sort of contribute a tiny little bit to keeping that attention and focus here in Prague. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. We're now moving over to Jan Havranek, who's going to say a few things about synergies between these 2 experiences. Yes. Well, if you want to, you can sit.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to the Institute and Embassies for organizing this event. It's definitely worth doing these things to keep up the attention, with one exception, that I don't see many politicians, if any politicians here, and that's maybe part of the problem too. You do have some bureaucrats here, you do have some diplomats who are aware of the of the issue, but no politicians. I very much appreciate the dose of reality that Paul has shared with us, and let me actually follow on from there. It's also difficult for me to speak as a second representative of the Ministry of Defence here today, but I'm lucky enough that Mr. Jireš left his notes here, so I can guess, about what he was talking about. I wasn't able to join the first panel, unfortunately, but let me say a few words on the general cooperation and what can we do together, the Czech Republic, Visegrad countries, and the Nordic Baltic region. First, I have to say that the Nordic cooperation has been a great source of inspiration, but also a source of frustration, in a way, to us. Why frustration? Well, obviously, you get the perception that Nordic cooperation is something well, it's the best regional defense security cooperation in the world, and will be never able to match it. You know, I call it the myth of the Finnish planner in the Swedish MOD that's been haunting us down the hallways at the Ministry of Defence. And I came to the conclusion that that it really is a PR problem, public relations problem on our end. I'm talking about the Visegrad cooperation, and also trying to see the entire situation with a more positive attitude, and that's why I also appreciate, as I called it, the dose of reality, that things are not black and white in either of the regions. Having said that, Nordic cooperation is indeed a source of inspiration, and we should find a way to bridge, I don't want to call it a gap, but in a way it is a gap between, I sometimes say that between the Nordic Baltic region and the Visegrad region there is Poland that's sort of sitting there and has the greatest potential to bridge the gap. And the question is whether we should rely solely on Poland and our Polish allies and friends. Apparently not, because there is much more that individual countries in both of these regions can do. And we indeed have a lot to offer. So what is it that we have in common? Obviously shared interest, both in strong European Union, strong NATO, depending on what the preferences of each of these countries are. It's been quite a pleasant experience recently to hear for example, the Swedish politicians talk about NATO at the EU meetings, CSDP meetings. We understand that there are some issues related to that domestically, but we very much support that. It was also very, very pleasant to find out that the Finnish or Swedish defense minister mentioning Visegrad and then Nordefco in this order. So definitely there's a general political will. Having said that, political will is not enough. It does require a certain commitment, a bureaucratic commitment, if not even micromanagement. Having been in the public administration for a couple of years now, I can confirm that you do really need to dive into an issue on the very low level if you want to see any results, and it takes time, at least maybe a year and a half, before you see actually some outcomes. But the good news is that there is a genuine shared interest and general perception that we ought to do more together. In some cases, and I will be talking mostly about the Czech Republic and Swedish relationship, there are issues such as shared platform, which may seem to offer that kind of a bridge that we may be looking for. Obviously, the Gripen aircraft, and we've had the potential for expansion in the region in multiple ways. But it's not the only platform in our case. For example, the Czech Republic and Sweden share other weapon systems such as the Manpads, RBS-70 and others. We also have shared industrial interest. These are a little more difficult and a little more complex than we may know at the first glance. Obviously, Sweden, Poland, Czech Republic. I don't want to offend any other countries in the region, but these are really the industry leaders in the Central Europe Northern Corridor, and the question is whether we can find common grounds. Obviously, one way to do that is to coordinate positions vis-à-vis the European institutions as they try to further fine-tune the European defense market. Let me use that verb. But it's also, again, not black and white. I mean, every country is very selfish when it comes to the defense interests, depending on the level of integration of the defense industries. In the Czech Republic, everything, most of the industry is in the private hands, which makes it a bit more difficult for the state to support or to find appropriate mechanisms. But we're trying. In fact, right today we had a first national armaments conference between the Ministry of Defence and the Association for the Defence Industries, where we actually indeed talked about all the issues and the need to coordinate and act together jointly, not only on the national level vis-à-vis the European institutions, but also in the wider regional setting. Visegrad cooperation and the Gripen cooperation were mentioned as the examples that we should learn from. We also have shared operational interest. This is what I would call it. We've learned some lessons in Afghanistan, in the Balkans. Both Finland and Sweden are now very much plugging into NATO's Connected Forces Initiative and the rotational NRF, NATO Response Force mechanisms. This is obviously a way we could cooperate and we should cooperate together, with the caveat that partnership is not membership, but it's pretty clear in this audience, so we don't need to go into detail. What are the most common projects, or what should we do? Air policing has been mentioned as one of the examples. Clearly, this is a mission. In fact, it's a NATO mission that we can. That's been a very much also a NORDEFCO mission in a sense, and that should continue. And I was pleased to learn that the Baltic countries have again decided to beef up their contribution vis-à-vis host nation support, and I know that Finland and Sweden are engaged in this aspect as well. EU battle group. It's been mentioned again. Why not to have a joint intra-regional battle group in the future? That's a relatively new idea. We should take some time, to get ready for that. We need to learn the lesson from our own Visegrad Central European battle groups, but why not to go that way? I've already talked about the industrial coordination, and what is also important is the coordination vis-à-vis third countries, be it in the defense industry area, be it in the partnership, Eastern Partnership, for example, and that is something we also have in common. Looking at my notes and my colleagues' notes from the MOD, I would suggest I stop here and leave more space to the questions. Thank you.
I'm gonna open the floor for questions, but first, listening to Paul and Jan. Well, the first conclusion one can draw is that really it seems like the glass is really half empty and not half full. It's a bit gloomy to hear realism sometimes, and you might have a point there. But then, of course, the fundamental question still remains. And Paul was talking a lot about sort of the pragmatic work beyond the flagship projects, and I came to think of that. The strategic environment that is really enabling this is of course the fact that most European countries do not perceive any existential threats. So that's sort of the general environment for these cooperative efforts. Now, and it struck me then that if this is one of the fundamentals, if we have on the one hand sort of the budgetary issues, and on the other hand the cooperative issues as part of this formula, and they're supposed to reinforce each other's, it might be that any changes in these dynamics actually becomes a bit of a paradox, because should there be a change in the security environment, some kind of securitization, it would be, of course, be easier to raise awareness of the defense budgets, but I'm not so sure that would actually help cooperative efforts. On the other hand, if we are to continue on this very pragmatic approach beyond the flagships, well, we can continue the cooperative efforts, but our budgets will shrink away. So it's really the one profits on the other in a way. I mean, how do you two wise men looking into the future, how do you actually perceive that we actually will deal with this problem?
See if I understood you, sort of your challenge correctly, as in how do we deal with the problem of not being able to actually go very far in our cooperation today, or sort of even in the long run?
Well, I mean, to maintain capabilities,
Yeah.
which is, of course, one of the reasons why we cooperate.
Yeah. It's going to be a challenge for the foreseeable future, and it's hard to see any easy way out of this. But sort of, I think it will just have to go in steps. And one way where I think one could save quite a bit of money, or sort of at least free resources to sort of use the way one should speak, I guess, is the joint acquisition. It is more complex when you have many countries wanting to buy the same stuff, and because it's sort of purely commercial terms, it's more difficult with more partners. It might actually cost a little bit more in terms of lawyers and all that and the other. But by buying things together and ideally also operating them together, and that's easier when it comes to sort of, for instance, as in transport planes and air-to-air refueling, and which are the sort of examples you have today. But sort of envisioning joint units in the next 10 years, I find that as not integrated to very, very low level. It's going to have to be separable at some point, because countries are not willing still to give up the control they have of the armed forces. But air policing, just to sort of grab that and sort of to rescue myself a bit here. Air policing, I think, is one of the issues that are going to become increasingly relevant. And there are actually many examples of air policing, not just the ones that are pretty well known as. Baltic air policing has been going on, has been high visibility. But Luxembourg and Belgium has always had a cooperation. As in Belgium has taken care of Luxembourg's air policing needs for I don't know how many decades, but it's a long time. Slovenia and Italy also have a bilateral arrangement which goes under a NATO flag, because Slovenia wanted it under a NATO flag. And then now this latest thing with Iceland, which is not really a full air policing effort, but it's a presence with an air policing mission. And you'll see many more countries in Europe losing their air forces in the future. And I'd imagine a few of them will be Visegrad countries. They might sort of survive with the Gripen for a while, but if they don't at some point in the future have enough money to buy new Gripens or buy whatever else, they'll be left without an air force. And this will force the question of who then takes care of air policing in these countries. And it's going to be a question they're all going to have to face. Either they'll do that in a regional context, or they'll have to invite some outside partner to help them.
Your question, Magnus, goes to the fundamental understanding of defense and security in the European continent. And if you read what's happening around the preparations for the European Council in fact, not couple of weeks, next week in Brussels, one of the messages is that defense matters, and there's a general idea that there should be a strong message towards the populations of the EU member states that the politicians are committed to further defense development and basically staying focused even at times when there are no major operations. Now the message will come out, that's pretty much given. The question is, what are the deeds that will follow to support that message? And I talk about the increase of defense budgets. Domestically, we fight a constant battle about the need to spend more on defense. The more we press, the more, and I talk about the expert community, the more we are seen as some war fanatics. It's a highly political issue. Now, having said that, let's also not be naive that there will not be any operations. Look at, for example, Mali, or look at the Central African Republic. It might not be in Central Asia, it might be in Africa, but it is important that we stay focused on what are now perceived maybe as non-traditional regions, but that in the early 90s, Balkans was not traditional regions for operation. Then came 9/11 and so on. So I think I would characterize the future task as opposed to what we've seen in Afghanistan is not to prepare for the current operation going on rotational basis every 6 months, you know, to a faraway country, but maybe to prepare for future operations. And that's why we have all those training plans and activities. And really, the question is, how do we translate a political commitment financially, investment wise, and training and planning wise?
Thank you very much. Now I was going to open the floor for questions.
No, we can go home then. You said it all, that's good.
We can talk all night. Actually, I can make a short comment. Just talk on this issue of operations. It has long been an ambition, at least in the Swedish-Norwegian context, of having a joint UN operation in Africa. Because it's in a sense easy, particularly if you have a sort of a traditional peacekeeping operation. And there was an attempt to send a force to Sudan, but that was blocked by Khartoum. And I believe that one of the topics that was sort of discussed in Helsinki last week was sort of the option of having a joint Nordic effort if there ever sort of comes to be a post-conflict force in Syria.
Okay, yes. I have a question over there. Please introduce yourself, sir.
From the Danish Embassy.
You will get a microphone.
I have it. Okay? Work?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, most of you have mentioned the word trust. Is it so that there is no trust between the Visegrad countries? Is there no trust among the Nordic countries? Is there more trust among the Nordic countries than the Visegrad countries? Is there any one of you who could elaborate a little on that?
Question of trust.
If I may, it's again, it's a political and bureaucratic question. You know, the political trust, in a way, needs to be renewed with every new government in a certain way. But the more continuity you get in terms of the processes and projects that you work on, the more trust you gain in general. If I look back for the past 2 or 3 years on the Visegrad cooperation, it actually started the defense cooperation. The new momentum obviously came with austerity and defense cuts, but there was a lot of skepticism on eventually all four ends because of the various historical connotations and also very recent connotations. For example, the Czech Republic and Slovakia had together an EU battle group in 2009, and my understanding is that the decision to establish that group and to plan it and coordinate came at the very last moment, and there was some let's put it diplomatically, not so good memories of the past on both sides. And this actually did contribute to a certain maybe initial hesitancy when it came to the Visegrad 4 battle group. So, you know, trust is an issue that it takes time to overcome. And as I said, as much as we love to cooperate and as much as we all agree on cooperation as a necessary means, you know, to achieve better capabilities, more security and defense and so on. I would reiterate that the states have always national interests. They have business interests. There are issues of national sovereignty, and these simply cannot be changed overnight.
I'll just sort of add that I'll tell a story to just illustrate that trust is also something that needs to be nurtured over time. And the story goes back a few years, but I think it was in June of 2009, where the Swedish Defence Minister Stefan Tolgfors had an op-ed in a Swedish newspaper, and also I think it was a talk he gave, where he introduced the idea of a joint Norwegian-Swedish fighter base in the north. This was in the time while still Norway was deciding whether to buy the Joint Strike Fighter or the Gripen. And Tolgfors then went on to say that we could have sort of one base, similar equipment, do things together. But obviously, if things go wrong, we go home. As in, if you get into trouble in the north, we go home. And Norwegian said, so you go home, and what if you have all the mechanics? What do we do then? Then we're dependent on you. So the point is that trust is not, it can be very easily sort of undermined by unfortunate statements by politicians or unfortunate acts by politicians or bureaucrats. So it needs to be nurtured and developed.
Further questions? There's a gentleman in the back. Please introduce yourself.
Hello. My name is Martin Bender. I have dedicated my studies to Nordic cooperation, not only defense-wise, but also cultural-wise, and to the Nordic Council of Ministers and Nordic Council of the members of the Parliament. And I remember one proposal of, I just forgot the name of the Norwegian politician, Stoltenberg, the father of Jens Stoltenberg. He had a report and proposing some reforms to the Nordic defense cooperation, and one of it was that the Nordic Council of Ministers should have also the defense sector. As I'm informed, it's not the case yet. So I'm asking you, after also the Nordefco experience, will that, in a foreseeable future, take place? Will the Nordic Council of Ministers have this defense agenda as well? Thank you.
Actually, I don't think that really matters. My answer is I don't think that, as in, it doesn't make a difference if it's the Council of Ministers or just the defense ministers, because the defense ministers have their platform now. They meet in a Nordefco setting. So as in, they're on par with the other ministers, just the label is different. So I wouldn't be sort of too concerned about that. I could say a few words about the Stoltenberg report. Thorvald Stoltenberg was challenged by the Council of Ministers to go above and beyond what was possible today. He himself talked about sort of going 25% beyond what was possible. And here we have to sort of read this last suggestion, the proposal number 13 that Magnus talked about, that he really wanted to push the political agenda by suggesting this. I don't think he necessarily believed it to be very viable in the short run. But one did get, as again Magnus said, a commitment, or sort of a pledge in Helsinki in 2011 that went up to but stopped short of traditional military challenges. So it basically talks about natural disasters, cyber attacks, and these things. And maybe in the future, then this can be built upon. And there are signs, also, at least Sweden has been pretty clear in the fact that it feels solidarity with its Nordic neighbors.
I'm very glad you mentioned the Stoltenberg report. I know that the Defense Austerity Visegrad 4 project has been mentioned here a couple of times, and indeed this was very much inspired by the works of Mr. Stoltenberg and his group. In fact, we've moved in the Visegrad cooperation a little beyond. At the latest meeting of the Prime Ministers of Visegrad in Budapest, which took place on October 14, the ministers signed a declaration on security and defense cooperation, and one of the taskings is in fact to draft a long-term vision of the defense cooperation. So something on a more, I don't want to say permanent, but towards the Nordefco mechanism. And one of the ideas, for example, that we currently play with, it haven't been set in stone yet, is the establishment of some sort of a defense planning board or defense advisory council to be supervised by the ministers and so on. So, in fact, there's been a great inspiration by the Nordic cooperation, the theoretical one. The real wise men did their work, and now it's the tasking for the MOD bureaucrats to actually get something on the paper. So we should be seeing more from Visegrad, hopefully next spring.
I have to tell one more little funny story. I was involved a bit with the Stoltenberg report, and it was very much a Minister of Foreign Affairs driven project, where the sort of the support staff came from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway, 2 people actually. And the suggestion came up to have joint embassies around the place. And that was quickly shot down by saying, no, there are so few embassies and so few ambassadorial posts around the world, so you don't want to suggest that because it will be shot down by the bureaucracy. And the point of telling this story is that you have to take interest into account, even in processes like that.
But there was a suggestion about...
well, joint embassies, but it was not ambassadorial posts, just having localities. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jan, for your remarks and your interventions. Now I hand the floor to Colonel Rastedt for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Magnus. I have done some remarks here, and I will try to wrap up what we have talking about the latest 2.5 hours almost. There was a headline on the seminar, Nordic and Visegrad experiences. And then when you look into the headlines on the two different parts which we have had discussion on, you can say that we started to talk maybe on experiences, and then we have been talking quite a lot on drivers, which I think is quite natural too, because that's what it's all about. If we look on on the first part, Magnus started to talk about taboo to dynamic sector, which was a historical reflection actually on how the Nordic Defence Cooperation started and developed. He mentioned more bang for the money, which is one of the key things. He also continued to talk about start with easy gains, which is also one of the main things, which I will end up with. Magnus also mentioned 3 roads of development. He discussed on minimal defense cooperation, flexible, and integrated. Then Mr. Gires continued with experiences from the Visegrad work. And he asked us why now, and then continued with the economy, U.S. change of prioritization from Europe to other parts of the world. And then he continued with why Visegrad, due to trust to history, which he also mentioned could be discussed. He also mentioned label of the Visegrad and the strategic culture. He also talked about synchronization of defense planning as one of the drivers of the future. Then Arto-Pekka Nurminen continued with experience from Nordefco until today, and he mentioned cross-border training in the northern part of Sweden. He mentioned the cooperation in Afghanistan. He also mentioned other air defense issues, training, of course, and also the development of the Nordic battle group. And he also started to talked about systematic and goal-oriented work as one of the drivers. Day-to-day cooperation, and you can see it in our headquarters in our different capitals today, where we have staff officers from our countries working together and trying to find those issues to pick up. And Arto-Pekka also mentioned developing the structure. It's not an organization, it's a structure for Nordefco. Then we went into policies for the future, which from my perspective is drivers. And Paul was discussing don't believe in miracles, build trust, and also kind of small step strategy. We mentioned in this issue also our 2 former shots, working together in the Stoltenberg report, which is also kind of related to persons in position. And in this case, it was a kind of bottoms-up work from our shots, when that was later picked up by the politicians in our countries. There was also a discussion on share capabilities, share going on operations together. It's easier than doing procurement together. Doing procurement together, you will have some other challenges coming in. You want to find a win-win in the cooperation, and also cooperation, it's not always cost saving. And then Jan Havranek started to talk about inspiration and frustration, mentioning the Nordefco. Maybe we are pretty good in Sweden in marketing things, but maybe also you have to pay Sweden a visit, or Norway or Finland, to look on more into details to see what we really are doing. It's a challenge to find solutions on defense industry. One of the drivers in the future is to get more integrated in EU and NATO missions, as we are doing now, I would say, in Sweden with the NATO response force, and also developing the battle group system. So that concludes my wrap-up and summary. So I would say that defense cooperation still seems to be a small step strategy with politics, national interests, and economy as drivers.
Okay, thank you very much, Colonel. And with those words, we conclude this conference. I would like to thank the organizers for taking this initiative, and I would like to thank you all for coming here. And I think we end up with a big round of applause for the panelists.